Alien worlds banned human horror exports because they caused mass psychological trauma. Part 1. Doctor had reviewed thousands of entertainment submissions during her career with the Galactic Entertainment Consortium. She prided herself on her professional approach to alien media. They were naturally curious beings and considered herself more open-minded than most. When the human submissions arrived, she treated them with the same careful attention she gave everything else. The first batch was unremarkable. Human comedies relied heavily on social embarrassment and miscommunication, which translated moderately well. Their dramas were competent if somewhat melodramatic. The documentaries about their home world were fascinating in a morbid way. Earth was classified as a Class 7 death world, and the humans seemed almost proud of this fact. They had produced an entire series about their planet's most dangerous predators with obvious enthusiasm. Filed her reports and approved the first wave for general distribution. Then she opened the second batch and saw a category she had never encountered before in any species submissions: horror. The description was simple enough: entertainment designed to elicit fear, dread, and suspense in the audience. Found this peculiar but not immediately concerning. Many species had cautionary tales or dark folklore. She selected a film the humans had rated as appropriate for younger audiences, something called The Presence. The description suggested it was a psychological thriller about a family moving into a new dwelling. She dimmed her office lights, as per the human recommendations, and began watching. The first 15 minutes were mundane. A human family unpacked boxes in an old house. The father made jokes. The mother expressed concern about strange sounds. The children explored rooms. Standard narrative establishment. Noted the effective use of ambient sound and made a comment in her review file about the cinematography. Then she felt it. The camera lingered on an empty doorway just slightly too long. The background noise faded in a way that made her secondary nervous system activate. Something in the frame was wrong, though she could not identify what. The human characters continued their conversation, unaware, but the audience knew something was watching them. Breathing membranes constricted. They had evolved in open planes with clear in all directions. The concept of being observed by an unseen entity triggered responses she did not know she possessed. Her people had no predators for millions of years. They had no monsters in their folklore. Being watched without seeing the watcher was not something that existed in psychology. She tried to continue watching. The film had barely begun, but her body was responding as though she were in genuine danger. Her tertiary heart rate increased. Her optical membranes refused to focus properly. When a door creaked open by itself on screen, revealing only darkness beyond, terminated the playback. She sat in her office for 20 minutes, waiting for her system to regulate. This had never happened before. It was just a film, just images and sound. Nothing real, nothing dangerous. Yet her entire being was convinced otherwise. Filed a preliminary report recommending additional review. She flagged the human horror category for psychological evaluation. Then she went home early, leaving the lights on in her dwelling for the first time in her adult life. The consortium received her report with interest but not alarm. Species-specific reactions were not uncommon. What affected the might not affect the or the. They approved limited distribution of human horror across 12 test worlds, each with different psychological profiles. It was standard protocol. The first incident reports arrived within 3 cycles. A colony world reported unusual medical visits. Citizens who had viewed a human film called Hereditary were experiencing persistent sleep disruptions. They reported dreams of being trapped, of their bodies acting against their will, of family members transforming into threats. There were communal species with deep family bonds. The film's central theme of inherited trauma and familial betrayal created cognitive dissonance their minds struggled to process. The Accord submitted a more serious complaint. Several viewers of a film called The Thing had developed what medical staff termed anticipatory dread syndrome. They experienced constant anxiety about transformation and replacement. They were shapeshifters by nature, able to modify their forms at will. The film's portrayal of forced, grotesque transformation as a source of horror conflicted with their fundamental identity. Some viewers reported being afraid of their own natural abilities. But the truly alarming report came from the Crystalline Collective. The collective was a telepathic species that existed partially in higher dimensions. They experienced reality through shared consciousness and mathematical precision. 3 members of the collective had viewed a human film called Event Horizon. The film dealt with a ship that had traveled to a place where physics broke down, where chaos and suffering existed without cause or pattern. The 3 crystallines who watched it experienced what their medical specialists called concept trauma. The ideas in the film had damaged them, not the images themselves, but the underlying concepts. The notion of a reality without mathematical order, of suffering without purpose, of consciousness existing in a place where natural laws failed. These concepts were antithetical to crystalline existence. The 3 individuals had to be isolated from the collective consciousness to prevent the trauma from spreading. Ambassador received the summons to appear before an emergency consortium session with confusion. She had spent the morning reviewing trade agreements and agricultural exchange programs. The horror film issue seemed minor by comparison. Humans had been sharing their entertainment with each other for centuries. It was just movies. The consortium chamber was more crowded than usual. Representatives from all 12 test worlds were present, and they did not look pleased. The ambassador spoke first, her mandibles clicking in a pattern that's translator rendered as distress. 3 of our citizens are catatonic, she said. They viewed a human film called The Ring. They have not spoken or moved in 2 cycles. Pulled up the file on her. The Ring was a remake of a Japanese horror film. It was rated for general audiences in most human territories. I'm very sorry to hear that, she said carefully. Can you tell me what specifically caused this reaction? The concept, the replied. Your film suggests that death can come arbitrarily, that one can die for no reason other than having witnessed something. This violates every principle our civilization is built upon. Actions have consequences, effects have causes. Your film suggests otherwise. It broke something in those who watched it. Looked at the other ambassadors. They were all waiting for her response. She chose her words carefully. In human culture, horror films are understood to be fiction. We know the events depicted are not real. The fear is temporary and controlled. We find it entertaining. The silence that followed was profound. Entertaining. The delegate doctor herself leaned forward. Ambassador, you are telling us that your species deliberately seeks out media designed to cause fear responses, for pleasure. Well, yes, said. It's a very popular genre. We have horror films, horror novels, horror games. It's been part of human culture for thousands of years. Why? The question came from a counselor. Why would any species seek out fear? Fear is a survival response. It exists to warn us of danger. Your people trigger this response deliberately in the absence of any actual threat. Realized she was standing at a cultural divide she had never anticipated. She thought about how to explain it. Humans evolved on a dangerous world, she began. For most of our history, we were both predators and prey. Fear kept us alive, but we also learned to practice fear, I suppose, to prepare for dangers by imagining them. Horror stories and frightening tales helped us survive. And over time, we learn to enjoy the experience of being scared safely. We get a rush from it. An excitement. You enjoy fear. The ambassador's translator struggled with the concept. You create art from terror. I suppose that's accurate, yes. The chamber erupted in agitated discussion. Heard fragments translated from dozens of languages. Incomprehensible, disturbing, dangerous, unnatural. The consortium director called for order. She was an ancient being from a species whose name humans could not pronounce. her crystalline form reflecting the chamber lights. "Ambassador," she said quietly, "we must ask you something directly. If your species has refined fear into an art form over thousands of years, if you have created increasingly sophisticated methods of triggering terror responses, what level of intensity has this art reached?" Felt something cold settle in her stomach. "I'm not sure what you're asking." "The films that have caused such damage to our citizens are rated as appropriate for human children. What happens when we examine the films you create for adults? What happens when we see the horror you find truly frightening?" Pulled up her and scrolled through the approved submissions. She saw the problem immediately. The consortium had only reviewed humanity's mildest horror offerings. The truly disturbing films had not even been submitted yet. She thought about movies like Martyrs or Audition or Funny Games. She thought about the entire of extreme horror that pushed boundaries even humans found difficult to watch. "I think," said slowly, "we may need to reconsider which films we share with the galactic community." The consortium director's form shifted colors in what had learned to recognize as concern. "Ambassador, we must quarantine all human horror immediately. Until we understand the full scope of this psychological hazard, we cannot allow further distribution. What you consider entertainment may be the most dangerous export humanity has produced." Wanted to argue. She wanted to explain that it was all just fiction, just pretend, just stories designed to thrill and frighten in safe environments. But she looked at the assembled delegates, at species who had evolved past predation and violence, who had built civilizations on peace and logic and mathematical precision. To them, human horror was not entertainment. It was a weapon they had accidentally deployed against themselves. Part 2. Doctor had never expected his career to lead him to a tribunal. He stood before representatives from 47 worlds, all of them demanding answers about humanity's relationship with fear. Some of the delegates looked at him with scientific curiosity. Others regarded him with something that looked like fear itself. The chamber was designed for beings far larger than humans and felt small under its vaulted ceiling. He had prepared his presentation carefully, but he knew that some things were difficult to explain across such fundamental psychological differences. "Thank you for inviting me to speak," he began, projecting his display onto the chamber's central screen. "I understand that human horror media has caused unexpected harm to many of your citizens. I want to start by saying that this was never intended. Humans view horror as entertainment, not as a psychological weapon." "Then explain to us how this came to be." The ambassador's tone was sharp. Her world had 23 citizens still recovering from what they called horror exposure. How does a species learn to enjoy terror? Advanced his first slide. It showed human evolutionary history, the branching tree of hominid development. Humans evolved on what you classify as a Class 7 death world. Earth has extreme weather, aggressive megafauna, deadly microorganisms, and frequent natural disasters. For millions of years, my ancestors lived with constant danger. Fear was not just useful, it was essential for survival. He showed images of Earth predators: lions, bears, crocodiles, venomous snakes, and spiders. Humans were both hunters and hunted. We developed complex fear responses to deal with this reality. Fear of the dark because predators hunted at night. Fear of sudden movements because attacks came without warning. Fear of disease and contamination because invisible threats killed just as surely as visible ones. Many species evolved under difficult circumstances, the delegate said. This does not explain your entertainment. You're right, agreed. Evolution explains why we feel fear. Culture explains why we seek it out. He changed the slide to show ancient human cave paintings. Humans began telling scary stories as soon as we could communicate. Every culture on Earth has a tradition of horror tales, ghost stories, monster legends, tales of cursed places and dangerous spirits. We use these stories to teach survival skills and to practice fear responses in safe environments. He showed more images now. a timeline of human horror through the ages. Ancient myths of creatures like the Mesopotamian, medieval European tales of vampires and werewolves, Japanese, African stories, Native American Wendigo legends. We never stopped telling these stories. As our civilizations grew, our horror grew with it. We refined it. We made it more sophisticated. We learned exactly which fears were universal to humans and how to trigger them precisely. The display shifted to show examples from human horror literature and film. Had carefully selected clips that he thought might be comprehensible without being harmful, though he was no longer certain what qualified as safe. Modern human horror exploits every fear our evolution gave us. Fear of the unknown, fear of death and disease, fear of losing our minds, fear of being watched by something we cannot see, fear of our bodies betraying us, fear of being alone, fear of crowds, fear of darkness, fear of confined spaces, fear of open spaces. Every possible anxiety has a horror genre devoted to it. But you enjoy this. A crystalline representative's voice echoed through the chamber. You voluntarily expose yourselves to these fear triggers. We do, confirmed. Because humans learned something unusual. We discovered that fear experienced in a safe context creates a physiological rush. Our bodies release adrenaline and other chemicals. Our heart rates increase. We become hyperalert. And then, when the danger proves to be imaginary, we experience relief and even euphoria. The fear becomes exciting rather than debilitating. He advanced to his next slide, showing brain scans of humans watching horror films. We call it riding the edge. We push ourselves to the limit of what we can tolerate, then step back to safety. It's similar to the thrill humans get from extreme sports or roller coasters. We have learned to enjoy the sensation of danger without the actual risk. The chamber was silent for a long moment. Finally, the counselor spoke. You are describing a form of psychological conditioning. Your species has trained itself to disconnect fear from survival and connect it to pleasure. That's one way to look at it, yes. And you have been refining this conditioning for how long? Pulled up historical data. Written horror stories date back at least 5,000 years. Oral traditions of scary tales are certainly older. Modern horror cinema is about 130 years old. In that time, humans have produced tens of thousands of horror films, constantly experimenting with new ways to frighten each other. You have had over a century to perfect fear as entertainment, the ambassador said slowly. A century of refinement and experimentation, and the films you submitted to us are what you show to your children. Felt the weight of that realization settle over the chamber. The films that caused harm to your citizens are considered mild by human standards. They're rated for general audiences. Some are considered classics suitable for family viewing. Then what do you show to adults? Had prepared for this question, but he still hesitated. Human horror for mature audiences deals with more intense themes: extreme violence, psychological torture, existential dread, body horror that depicts the human form being corrupted or destroyed in graphic detail. They are specifically designed to disturb even experienced horror viewers, films that push boundaries of taste and comfort. He showed them titles and brief descriptions without images. The French extreme horror movement, Japanese gore films, psychological horror that left viewers questioning their sanity, found footage films that blurred the line between fiction and reality, art house horror that used fear to explore philosophical concepts. We even have meta-horror, continued, films about the nature of fear itself, stories that interrogate why we watch horror and what it says about humanity. The genre has become so sophisticated that we have horror films designed to frighten people who have built up tolerance to conventional horror. A small delegate from a species did not recognize raised a manipulator appendage. You are describing an arms race of fear. Each generation of human horror must be more frightening than the last to affect audiences who have become desensitized. That's actually a very accurate description, yes. Where does it end? The delegate asked. At what point does human horror reach a limit? did not have an answer to that. The truth was that human horror kept evolving, kept finding new fears to exploit and new ways to present them. Every year brought innovations in how to frighten audiences. Virtual reality was opening entirely new possibilities for immersive terror, interactive horror that adapted to individual fears, AI-generated horror tailored to specific psychological profiles. "I don't think it ends," he admitted. "Fear is too fundamental to human psychology. As long as we remain human, we will continue to explore it." The chamber erupted in agitated discussion again, heard translations flowing through multiple languages. Some delegates were frightened, some were angry, a few sounded fascinated. One warrior was demanding access to human horror as a test of mental fortitude, arguing that his species should not be sheltered from challenges. But most of the delegates were focused on a different concern. Agent of the Antares League stood to speak. The Antares were a calculating species, known for their strategic thinking. "Doctor, I have a question about intent. You say that human horror is created for entertainment, not as a weapon. But you have also described a century of research into how to trigger fear responses effectively. You have identified psychological vulnerabilities and learned to exploit them. You have tested these methods on billions of human subjects and refined them based on their responses." "That's correct," said, not liking where this was going. "Then let me ask you this. If humanity can create fear-inducing media that causes psychological trauma in alien species unintentionally, what could you create intentionally? If you wanted to craft psychological attacks specifically designed to exploit non-human mental architecture, how effective could you be?" The chamber went very quiet. Felt dozens of eyes on him. He thought about the question carefully. Humans had spent centuries learning to frighten each other. They had built entire industries around fear. They understood how to manipulate emotions, how to create anticipation and dread, how to subvert expectations and trigger anxiety. If that knowledge were turned toward, if human horror creators studied alien psychology with the same dedication they had studied human psychology, "I think," said quietly, "it would be very effective." "That is what concerns us," replied. "You have demonstrated that your species possesses a deep understanding of psychological manipulation through fear. You have shown that you can create cognitive hazards capable of causing lasting harm to other species. Whether or not you intended this harm is irrelevant to those who have suffered it. What matters is capability." Wanted to argue that humans had no intention of weaponizing their horror, that it was purely entertainment, purely art. But he looked at the faces around him and understood their fear. To them, humanity was a species that had mastered psychological warfare and then called it culture. A species that refined terror into an art form and enjoyed it recreationally. How could they trust that such a species would never turn that knowledge toward darker purposes? "Doctor," the consortium director said, "we thank you for your explanation. You have helped us understand the scope of this issue. We will now deliberate on appropriate restrictions." Was escorted from the chamber. As he left, he heard the debates beginning behind him. Some delegates wanted a complete ban. Others wanted quarantine protocols. A few were arguing about cultural suppression and censorship. There were still demanding access, calling it a challenge worth facing. But underlying all the discussions was a new wariness. Humanity had revealed something about itself that could not be unrevealed. They were the species that enjoyed fear, the beings who had weaponized their nightmares and called it entertainment, the creatures from a death world who had never stopped being dangerous, even after they reached the stars. Part 3. The consortium passed the cultural hazard restrictions 3 weeks after his testimony. The vote was not quite unanimous, but the opposition was small. All human horror exports were banned from galactic distribution. Existing copies were to be destroyed or secured in research facilities. Any human media containing fear-based content required pre-screening and certification before distribution. Humanity was required to establish a ratings board that would work with consortium psychologists to evaluate all cultural exports. Ambassador signed the agreement in a quiet ceremony. She understood why it was necessary. The harm had been unintentional but real. Dozens of alien citizens were still recovering from horror exposure. Some would carry psychological scars for the rest of their lives. The Crystalline Collective had lost 3 members who could never fully rejoin their shared consciousness. But something felt wrong about the whole situation. Humanity had been sharing horror stories with each other for thousands of years. It was part of their culture, their art, their way of understanding the world. Being told that this fundamental aspect of their expression was too dangerous for others felt like being told they were too dangerous, too strange, too other. The ban had immediate consequences that no one had anticipated. Within 2 months, a black market emerged. Smugglers discovered that human horror films were incredibly valuable to certain segments of the galactic population. Thrill seekers wanted to experience what they called the human fear high. Young aliens rebelled against protective laws by seeking out banned media. Some species found that horror gave them access to emotions they had never felt before. A name became the first documented horror addict. She had watched The Haunting of Hill House through illegal channels and found herself craving more. She spent her savings acquiring human horror films, watching them alone in darkened rooms, chasing the fear response that had become intoxicating. When authorities found her, she had watched 47 films in 2 months and was experiencing severe psychological distress, but she still wanted more. Rehabilitation centers opened on 17 worlds within 6 months. Medical professionals struggled to treat something they barely understood. How do you help someone recover from voluntary exposure to concepts that traumatize them? How do you explain addiction to fear to species that had no framework for such a thing? Not everyone viewed the ban as reasonable. The warrior clans formally protested. They argued that being shielded from challenging content was insulting. Their culture valued strength and endurance. If human horror was a test of mental fortitude, they wanted to face it. The consortium refused, citing duty of care, which only made them more determined to access the forbidden media. A more interesting opposition came from the observers. This enigmatic species existed partially outside normal spacetime and communicated rarely with physical beings. When they did make contact about the ban, their message was clear. Human horror was the most interesting art humanity had produced. It explored fear in ways no other species had conceptualized. Banning it was cultural suppression based on a patronizing assumption that other species needed protection from ideas. Some human philosophers agreed. There were debates on Earth about whether the ban implied that humanity was inherently dangerous, that their culture was a threat. Some argued that the consortium had no right to determine which human art was acceptable. Others countered that causing unintentional harm created ethical obligations, regardless of artistic merit. But the broader effect of the ban was more subtle. Humanity's reputation in the galactic community shifted. They were no longer just another newcomer species, eager and naive. The horror incident had revealed something about them that could not be hidden. They were the species from a death world who had never stopped being dangerous. They carried their violent evolution in their minds. They made art from atrocity and called it entertainment. Other species began treating humans with caution, not fear exactly, but wariness. The kind of respect you give to something that might be more dangerous than it appears. Trade continued. Diplomatic relations remained cordial, but there was an undercurrent now, an acknowledgement that humanity was different in fundamental ways. Noticed it in meetings, the way other ambassadors chose their words more carefully around her. The way discussions of conflict or violence became uncomfortable when humans were present. Earth was increasingly seen as a warrior culture, though humans had been peaceful members of the galactic community. The horror ban had marked them in ways they were still discovering. Then the swarm invaded consortium space. The first worlds fell within days. There were a hive mind species that used psychological warfare as their primary weapon. They broadcast images and concepts directly into the minds of their victims. Visions of transformation, of being absorbed into a collective consciousness that would erase individual identity. Sounds that triggered primal panic responses. Ideas that created existential dread and paralyzing fear. Species after species froze before the assault. All the civilizations that had evolved past predation found themselves unable to function in the face of calculated terror. Their populations experienced mass panic. Their militaries could not organize. They moved through consortium space like a dark wave, conquering through fear alone. The Consortium Emergency Council convened. They had conventional weapons that could harm but they could not deploy them if their populations were psychologically paralyzed. They needed a solution to the psychological warfare. They needed a species that could face the horror tactics without breaking. Every ambassador in the chamber realized the answer at the same moment. They all turned to look at. "No," she said immediately. "You banned our horror. You called it dangerous and restricted it because it hurt your citizens. Now you want us to fight psychological warfare for you." "We were wrong to call it just entertainment," the consortium director said. "We understand now that it was training. Your species has spent centuries preparing for exactly this kind of attack." Felt anger and vindication warring in her chest. "You're asking humans to fight because we're already familiar with being terrorized, because we've desensitized ourselves to fear." "We are asking humans to fight because you can," said bluntly. "They are winning because they exploit fear that we cannot process, but humans process fear differently. You have built psychological defenses we lack. You are the only species in the consortium that might be immune to their attacks." Contacted Earth Military Command. Within 48 hours, human forces were deploying to contested zones. The rest of the galaxy watched with apprehension and hope. The human soldiers encountered psychological broadcasts on the third day of deployment. The transmissions were designed to cause overwhelming dread, images of bodies being consumed and reformed, sounds that triggered panic in every species that had encountered, concepts of losing individual identity and becoming part of something vast and hungry. The human soldiers watched the broadcast with interest. Some took notes. A few actually laughed. Captain filed a report that would become famous throughout the galaxy. The psychological attack is reminiscent of the body horror genre, specifically David's work. The transformation imagery lacks originality. The sound design is effective but derivative. Overall rating, 6 out of 10. Moderately frightening by human standards, but we've seen better. Though for the first time in their expansionist history, encountered a species that was not afraid of them. More than that, they encountered a species that analyzed their fear tactics like critics reviewing a film. Human soldiers discussed the psychological warfare the way they might discuss a movie. They identified techniques, commented on effectiveness, compared it to human horror they had seen. They adapted. They tried to study human psychology and create attacks specifically designed to terrify humans. They broadcast images of humanity's worst fears drawn from captured data. Spiders, snakes, isolation, loss of loved ones, death by disease. The humans were briefly more unsettled. Then they adapted too, because humans had spent generations learning to face their fears through fiction. They had practiced terror responses until they could control them. They could feel fear and function anyway because they had trained themselves to do exactly that. Within 2 months, human psychological warfare specialists were doing something unprecedented. They were reverse engineering the tactics. They studied the hive mind psychology, identified vulnerabilities, and crafted broadcasts specifically designed to terrify the. They used everything humanity had learned from a century of horror cinema. Every technique for creating dread, building suspense, subverting expectations, and triggering existential panic. The human psychological attacks were devastatingly effective. The swarm, which had never experienced fear of their own, had no defenses against it. Their hive mind, which had been their strength, became a weakness as panic spread through the collective consciousness faster than they could isolate it. Human broadcasts showed the concepts they had never imagined: individuality as beauty, separation as freedom, the death of the collective as liberation. 6 months after the invasion began, the retreated from consortium space. Their hive mind had been fractured by concepts it could not process. Some had even separated from the collective entirely, experiencing individuality for the first time. The invasion collapsed not because humanity had superior weapons, but because humans had weaponized the very thing the consortium had banned them for. The consortium held a ceremony to honor humanity's contribution, accepted the recognition on behalf of Earth, but the atmosphere in the chamber was complex. There was gratitude, certainly, relief that the threat had been stopped, but there was also fear. Because humanity had proven exactly what had warned about during the tribunal. They had demonstrated that they could create psychological attacks specifically designed to exploit alien psychology. They had taken their understanding of fear and turned it into a weapon that could shatter the minds of other species. And they had done it in 6 months. The ban on human horror exports will be partially lifted, the consortium director announced. Horror will be reclassified as a strategic cultural resource. Species may apply for access through appropriate channels with psychological screening and support services in place. Stood to respond. She felt the weight of dozens of species watching her, all of them reassessing what humanity meant to the galactic community. We accept your recognition and your revised restrictions, but I want to be clear about something. Humans did not create horror as a weapon. We created it as art, as entertainment, as a way to explore our fears safely. What we did to them was necessary, but it was not who we are. We don't want to be the galaxy's specialist in psychological warfare. But you are, said quietly. Whether you want to be or not, you have shown us what you're capable of. We cannot forget that. Nu was right. Humanity's role in the galaxy had changed permanently. They would always be the species that made art from fear, the beings who had weaponized their nightmares, the creatures from a death world who had turned their evolutionary trauma into culture and then into victory. She thought about all the horror films banned across dozens of worlds, all the scary stories humans told each other, the ghost tales and monster legends and psychological thrillers. They had seemed so harmless, just entertainment to make people scream and laugh and feel alive. But to the rest of the galaxy, they were something else. Evidence of a species that had survived by mastering fear. A species that was comfortable with terror in ways no one else could understand. We are what evolution made us, said finally. Earth was a harsh teacher. It taught us to be afraid of the dark, to imagine dangers lurking just out of sight, to tell each other scary stories so we could practice surviving. We turned those lessons into art because that's what humans do. We transform our pain into meaning, our fears into entertainment, our nightmares into stories. She looked around the chamber at all the assembled species. You banned our horror because it hurt you. Then you asked us to use it to save you. I hope you understand now that you can't have it both ways. If you want humans in your consortium, you have to accept all of what we are, including the parts that frighten you. The chamber was silent for a long moment. Then the consortium director spoke. We understand, Ambassador, and we accept. Humanity will always be welcome in the consortium, but you must understand something as well. You have shown us that in the vast darkness between stars, sometimes the scariest thing is not what lurks in the shadows. Sometimes it's the species that learn to dance with those shadows and call it entertainment. Returned to Earth after the ceremony. She filed her reports and briefed government officials. But that night, alone in her quarters, she did something she had not done in months. She turned off the lights, put on a horror film, and let herself feel that familiar thrill of fear, the comfort of controlled terror, the satisfaction of facing darkness and surviving. Because that was what it meant to be human, to look at nightmares and see stories, to face fear and find entertainment, to dance with monsters and call it art. The rest of the galaxy might find it disturbing, but humans understood something fundamental. The best way to survive the darkness was not to hide from it, but to learn to live with it, to master it, to make it part of who you were. And if that made humanity frightening to others, well, humans had learned long ago that being frightening could be its own kind of safety. On a death world, sometimes the best protection was making sure nothing else was more dangerous than you. Smiled in the darkness as the movie played. The galaxy had learned what humanity was, and humanity had learned what the galaxy needed them to be. Monster makers and monster fighters. The species that understood fear so well they could weaponize it or turn it into art as the situation required. It was not the role humanity had expected to play among the stars, but it was, perhaps, the role they had been preparing for all along.